welcome. So today we're going to be introducing this idea of revenue, and you've probably heard about revenue before. You might have done business studies at GCSE and you might know a little bit about revenue, or you might have just seen it in the news, or you might just know a little bit of kind of common knowledge about what revenue is. Now today we are going to be looking at revenue under the guise of kind of economics and what we consider revenue, or what we consider to be important aspects of revenue, and we're going to have a look at kind of how we map revenue and the relationship between revenue and the firm. But firstly, here's something that you should be super familiar with. It's just a demand curve. It's a downward sloping demand curve. So we know that it's kind of your average good. It's not a given good. And we've got two kind of relationships here along the demand curve. Now, traditionally, what you've kind of known up until now when we look at price elasticity of demand is we look at the quantity kind of change when we have a price change. And the lines that you've kind of been seeing to represent elastic or inelastic have kind of given you an idea of what you might think elastic or inelastic demand might look like. So you might kind of traditionally think of an inelastic demand curve as looking like this one here, and you might think and look at this demand curve here and think that that's relatively elastic. And we're going to kind of have a look at that a little bit to start us off with today. So I have two kind of aspects of our demand curve, two relationships along the demand curve. The change in price from £10 to £9, and looking at the quantity change, quantity demand change there, and then looking at the change from £2 to £1 and looking at the quantity demanded change there. Now, on the surface, when you look at this, and a lot of you will kind of instantly think that they're exactly the same, right? Because nominally, they are the same. So nominally 10 to 9 is £1 difference, nominally 2 to 1 is £1 difference, nominally 1 to 2 is a unit's worth of difference, and nominally 9 to 10 is a unit's worth of difference. But remember, when we look at price elasticity of demand, we're not looking at a nominal relationship, we're looking at a proportional relationship. So you quite often hear economists talk about how obviously if there's a change in price, there is going to be a more than proportional response or a less than proportional response to quantity demanded. And that word proportional is super, super important, because the proportional change from 10 to 9 is very, very different to the proportional change from 2 to 1. Nominally they're the same, proportionally they're completely different. A change from 10 to 9 is a 10% proportional change, but whereas from 2 to 1, you are changing by 50%, you've cut it in half, right? And again, 1 to 2, that is doubling, that's 100% change, and 9 to 10 is 11% change. So really, these relationships by that are obviously going to be proportionally, potentially very, very different. And we can see that here. So if we go from 10 to 9, we see our quantity demanded increase from 1 to 2, but it doubles, right? It's doubled. We now have double the amount of quantity demanded. So if we plug that into our price elasticity, we are looking at our percentage, our proportionality, percentage change. So essentially what you're saying is that there is a 10% change minus 10%, and we've doubled the amount, which means that, I'll just plug those numbers into the price elasticity of demand, we have a 10 value for our price elasticity of demand. Now 10 is incredibly elastic, it's super elastic. We have a 10% change and we've doubled the amount of people who want to buy the good or service. And then we have a look at 1 to 2. We're cutting the price in half. We've halved the price here, so we have a 50% change in our price. And what is happening to our quantity demanded? Well, we've gone from 9 to 10. Or, like I said before, that's only roughly about 11%. So we've cut the price by 50%, but we've only got 11%. We've only invited potentially one additional person, 11%, to come and kind of enter the market and buy that good or service, which gives us a price elasticity of demand of 0.2, which is incredibly inelastic. So we now have an inelastic section of our demand curve, and we know that this relationship here is very different to this relationship here. And that might be difficult for you to understand straight off the bat, but it's all to do with the fact that it's percentage changes and not nominal changes, right? And as you worked out, and you can work out if you go from 9 to 8 to 7 to 6 to 5 to 4 to 3 to 2, 1, you will be able to work out the price elasticity of demand, and you'll see it becoming more and more inelastic as price falls and our quantity demanded as we go down that demand curve. So what is that really telling us? Well, it's telling us that the relationship between price and quantity is changing as our price is changing, is falling specifically. And what you need to think about is, well, when does it become neither elastic or inelastic? So here we know that that is obviously going to be, if you work it out, it's going to be at 5, but that is true of all demand curves, no matter what the number is, it's halfway along the demand curve. So for us that happens to be at 5, but for any demand curve it's halfway along the demand curve. So essentially what we're saying is our demand curve has 2 different kind of sections of relationships. So the first half of our demand curve is elastic. So as we can see here, a small price in change or any price in change is going to lead to a more than proportional change in quantity demanded. And our second section, the bottom section of our demand curve, is inelastic. So what we mean by that is that the percentage change in price is going to lead to a less than proportional change in quantity demanded. So what's happening at this point here? It's proportional, right? We're saying that it's 1 for 1. So a 1% change in price is going to lead to a 1% change in quantity demanded. It is a proportional, it's not more than proportional, it's not less than proportional. Now you might be sat there thinking, what on earth has this got to do with revenue? And that would be an excellent question, which we will get to later. But what you need to think about is, what is the relationship between price elasticity of demand and revenue? Well, if you think back previously, we've spoken about how firms are able to increase or decrease their revenue knowing whether their demand curve is elastic or whether their demand curve is inelastic. And we're going to touch on that later. But this is definitely something that you have to have in your brain when we are talking about revenue. So, what is revenue? I know you're all dying to know what revenue actually is. So you are correct when you learn in business studies that revenue is literally just the income generated from sales. And that's an essential kind of keyword in business studies and economics for sure. But in economics generally, we don't really care so much about actual overall total revenue. Like, it's useful to know, but it's mainly useful for us to know so that we can work out other actual revenues that we do care about, which leads me very nicely to average revenue. Average revenue is something that we really care about in economics. It's really, really important. As we move forward, you're going to see that we have diagrams, and average revenue is an incredibly important part of those diagrams. It helps us to be able to see profit. And average revenue is just our total revenue divided by the amount that we are selling, right? So it is our average revenue, so the amount of revenue you're making per unit sold on average, right? That's important because you're not necessarily making the same amount of revenue per unit you have sold, but over all of the units you sold, you have an average revenue. And then the second one that's really, really important, as equally as important as average revenue, is marginal revenue. Now, marginal revenue probably isn't something that you may necessarily have come across before, but marginal revenue is the same as all the other marginal stuff that we have learned about. It's literally just the additional revenue from selling 1 extra unit, right? So if I go from selling 10 units to 11 units, I go from making £100 to £110, then my marginal revenue is £10, right? Because I've sold 1 additional unit for £10. So my marginal revenue is £10. And your marginal revenue might be different, and more often than not will be different, to your average revenue, right? So at the same quantity, your marginal revenue or average revenue will be different, right? Because especially if your price is changing. There are some very specific examples where your average revenue and marginal revenue are exactly the same, and we will look at those much later on. But more often than not, in fact, in all real kind of economic examples, your marginal revenue and average revenue are often very different. So what we're going to do is we're going to calculate, we're going to have a look at these relationships, and then we're going to kind of split it up so we can go through it mathematically and prove it mathematically, and then we're going to go through it logically and theoretically. So let's start off. So what I'd like you to do, I've got here our price per unit, I've got our quantity that we are sold at that price. There is something that you really need to know. There is kind of two really important things that separate business studies and economics. One of them we're going to learn about when we look at profit. But one of the most important things is, in economics, we assume that the firm will sell every single unit that it produces, right? So we assume that whatever quantity is produced is sold. Now, the reason that we presume that, and you don't necessarily make that same assumption when you are looking in business studies, is because we look at market mechanisms. So we assume that the market will clear, right? It's one of our founding kind of principles, that we assume that the market will clear at a certain price. So therefore, whatever is made will be sold, right? So if they produce 200, they will sell 200 at £20. Right, and we make that assumption across economics, at least at A level, we make all of those assumptions, and it's really important for you to understand that, and it's important for you to understand why and where that comes from, and it comes from just normal market mechanisms. The idea that, like through rationing and signalling and normal market mechanisms, the market will eventually clear. So we assume everything that is produced is going to be sold. So what I want you to work out is, I want you to work out the total revenue, I want you to work out the average revenue, and I want you to work out the marginal revenue. So pause the video, have a go at trying to work these out, use the definitions as spoken about in literally 5 minutes ago, and have a go at trying to work this out. What you should have is this. So to work out our total revenue, all we have done is we have taken our price and we have times it by our quantity, right? And that has given you our total revenue. And there are some things that you should be noticing about total revenue is obviously as the price has decreased, initially our total revenue increases, but then as the price falls past a certain point, what's happening to our total revenue? It is decreasing. Now, all I want you to do is think about right at the start when we're looking at price elasticity of demand. These numbers here kind of prove what we were talking about before, right? So what it proves is that as the price falls, revenue will increase up to a certain point. So what's happening there then? Well, you're saying that as the price falls, you're having a more than proportional change in quantity demanded. So what's happening to your revenue? Your revenue is increasing. If your revenue is increasing when you reduce the price, then therefore the price elasticity of demand has to be elastic. Because what's happening is the price is falling and you're having a more than proportional change in your quantity demanded. If you're having a more than proportional change in your quantity demanded when your price falls, it's elastic by definition. So therefore, for this section up until here, where the price is falling, its revenue, total revenue is increasing, right? And therefore, it has to be elastic. And equally, then we get to a certain point where as our price is falling, this then becomes, our total revenue starts to fall, right? So our total revenue starts to fall. If you reduce the price and your revenue is falling, then that has to mean that there is a less than proportional change in your quantity demanded. Therefore, it has to be inelastic, right? So it has to be inelastic. So that price elasticity of demand and that relationship changing and having an elastic section, having an inelastic section is really simply proven when we kind of have a look at some numbers and you can physically see that our revenue is increasing and then decreasing. And that's really important, right? And it's important because when we look at revenue maximization, when we look at firms' intentions and economic kind of decision making, this will become really, really useful. And equally it will become useful when we have a look a little bit later on, even in this lesson potentially. So we know that our total revenue is increasing and then decreasing when the when the price change enters into the inelastic section of our demand curve. We can see that here. And also something else that's really interesting, and I'm sure that most of you kind of would have clocked straight away anyway, is this average revenue here. Our average revenue obviously is going to be equal to the price, right? And that seems intuitive, that seems pretty obvious by nature, but it's actually really important, and it allows us to kind of make a really useful assumption, kind of representation of our demand curve. And secondly, our marginal revenue. Now, some of you might have got this wrong, and you might have put, so the difference between total revenue, which is 500 for this one here, but remember you are selling 50 additional units, right? So for this one, for average revenue, you're obviously just taking total revenue and you're dividing it by quantity sold. So for your marginal revenue, here you want the additional revenue from selling one extra unit. So our revenue has increased by 500, right? From 4,000 to 4,500. But our quantity has increased by 50. So you want to divide that by 50, which is going to give you 10. And that's exactly what I've done for all of these here. So obviously you have 300 divided by 50 is 6. And there's something really important that you should note here as well. Marginal revenue, average revenue, and total revenue is never going to be below zero, right? Because if you're selling something for free, then you're not going to get any revenue. It's going to be zero. You aren't going to make minus revenue. So one of the differences between your average revenue curve and your demand curve is that your average revenue curve will hit zero, because there will be a point in which you are selling at zero and therefore you're not going to make any revenue. So it will hit zero. But your marginal revenue can go below zero, right? And you can see that here, like obviously at this point here, your marginal revenue goes below zero, and your marginal revenue goes below zero at what point? Like, when does your marginal revenue become zero? When can you make the assumption of your marginal revenue becoming zero? That's something that you should really, really think about, and it's definitely going to become really, really useful for next lesson. So your marginal revenue can become zero, but you're below zero, and your marginal revenue is below zero at the same quantity at which your average revenue is above zero, right? So your marginal revenue can be minus, and your average revenue can be positive, right? And these kind of numbers and this here shows us a lot, and that might feel like a little bit overwhelming. But we've done it mathematically, and now we're just going to have a look kind of theoretically at what these numbers can kind of tell us about the marginal revenue and the average revenue kind of on a diagram, theoretically on a diagram. So here we have our price and quantity. This is the exact same diagram, or you can think of it kind of as the exact same diagram as right at the start, where we had like 10 to 9 to 8. The only difference here is that I've got it hitting zero. I've done that for a reason. As you can see on our kind of previous, where we worked it out in our table, your average revenue is equal to your price, right? Now, that allows us to make a really useful kind of connection, which is that your demand curve for a firm is going to be equal to their average revenue curve. Right? So the average revenue is going to be equal to the demand curve. So the demand curve here, you can, if you think about it, it's a demand curve to start off with, actually is equal to our average revenue curve. Right? So our average revenue curve is equal to our demand curve. Now the last thing to really think about, and kind of one explanation that's going to help you out here, and that's important for you to understand, is that the firm's demand curve, and this is something that we have learned about before, the firm's demand curve may well be different, have a different elasticity, be different to the industry's demand curve, right? And that relates a little bit towards market power, but it also just relates to substitutes, right? So a firm's demand curve might be different to an industry's demand curve, right? The demand curve for games consoles might be completely downward sloping, relatively elastic, the demand curve for Sony is going to be far more inelastic, because there might be a lot of substitutes for the industry as a whole of game consoles, but then if you want to buy a games console, there's not that many substitutes. There's one big substitute for Sony. And that might be different for other industries, right? So for instance, the demand curve for hairdressers, especially during, our current situation, might be particularly inelastic, right? It might be very, very inelastic for demand curve for an industry. However, for a firm, one individual hairdressers, their demand curve is going to be inelastic, because if you want to get your hair cut, you have to enter the market. The industry is very inelastic. However, if you enter the market, there's loads of options for you. There's loads of substitutes. There are lots of different hairdressers that you can go to. And therefore, the demand curve for the firm, for an individual hairdresser, might be completely different to the demand curve for an industry. Which leads me to kind of our last point here. When we say that the average revenue curve is equal to the demand curve, what we're saying is that the average revenue curve is equal to the firm's demand curve. We're not saying that the average revenue curve is equal to the industry's demand curve, is equal to the firm's demand curve. So for hairdressers, the average revenue might be equal to the firm's very inelastic demand curve, because there's lots and lots of substitutes, whereas it's not going to be equal to a potentially more inelastic demand curve for the industry of hairdressing. So a firm's average revenue is equal to their demand curve to their demand curve. Underline their demand curve, right? It's not equal to the industry's demand curve. And you would be surprised, people get really, really, really mixed up. It's really important for you to get that in your head, because when we start looking at market structures, it's going to be a lot kind of more simple for you to get your head around that as well, if you really understand that difference. So I hope today's been useful, and next lesson we're going to have a look at average revenue and marginal revenue together, and the relationship between the two. I look forward to it. See you later.